Good morning, everybody, and welcome to part one of our trip around Malham. It's a short dale of around about 6 miles, but we're just concentrating at the head of it, looking at Malham village and up to the Tarn, the Cove and Gordale Scar, of course. And so it's approximately a 6 mile trip that we're going to take around this area, starting off at the village, going up to the Cove, and then I'm looking at this area around here, Pikedaw as it's called, then coming up to the Tarn itself. And that's where we're going to end today. The second part, we're going to set off at Stockdale Lane. It starts around about here. This is a continuation of the road in front of the Tarn, dropping down the Tarn by the side of the hill there, coming across to Janet's Foss, Gordale Scar, and then returning to the village. That's because we're in part two. This whole area is made of Carboniferous limestone. It was laid down around about 300 million years ago, and it was also covered by a great sea during that time. That's how the Carboniferous limestone was formed. It was a tropical climate as well, so it was very warm around here. After that, we had some great earthquakes, and that shifted the ground around here, creating two faults. The road that runs in front of Malham Tarn, Street Gate as it's called, is the upper Craven fault. The lower down here where Malham Cove is, that's the middle Craven fault, continues over to Gordale Scar as well. And there's a lower Craven fault, which we'll see in a successive week down by Linton Falls near Grassington as well. Because its most spectacular feature is the Cove, which is down here, which is between sort of 260 and 300 feet high. So let's get the route underway. We're going to start off at the entrance into the village by the National Park Centre. The Yorkshire Dales National Park was formed in 1953 and took in Malham Dale. The car park here, £2.70 for 2 hours and £4.70 for the rest of the day. It's got toilets, it's got a visitor centre down here, which is a small exhibition about the area, and there's also a little shop. It tends to be open between 10 and 4 o'clock. 2020 has seen it being very busy around Malham and this car park being full. They've opened up the field on the other side of the road on the way in to be an overfilled car park as well. You'll see on a bit of film I have here is that come the middle of the afternoon, that car park was jam full as well. And even the road in on the grass verges have been full. Largely in accounts is that there's no parking in the village centre. They've put cones all the way around there, and some of the roads are closed too. The road to Gordale Scar through there. On the way in, on the left-hand side is the first building that we see. That was the Methodist Chapel of 1865. It's probably at the end of the village, or the start of the village, because it would probably attract people from Kirby Malham as well up here. There isn't a parish church in Malham. That's at Kirby Malham as well. So it probably accounts for the where the churches are located. And indeed, the school is built midway between the two villages as well. We need to come across the road from here, where the field is, where it's used as an overflow car park today, because you can go down that public footpath down there, down the side of Malham Beck. You cross an access road for Yorkshire Water into their water treatment plant, and just beyond there, on the right-hand side, you can see this spring. This is where the River Aire rises. It's not the one that comes out at the bottom of the cove. In fact, this water, as we'll see, comes down a sinkhole just to the south of Malham Tarn and reappears out of here and then joins Malham Beck, and then Malham Beck becomes the River Aire. You'll see that on a bit of film I've filmed from Hanliffe, which is just above Kirby Malham, looking down there. So that is the River Aire coming down there. To say it flows through Leeds and then joins the River Ouse fairly close to Goole, and then enters into the North Sea via the Humber estuary. So that's the source of the River Aire. And then I've mentioned Malham Beck that comes out of the bottom of the River Cove, of the Malham Cove, flows through the village, dividing into half. And that's been quite important because this boundary, the River Beck, was a boundary of two different manors. This on the right-hand side here belonged to the Percy family in medieval times. They gave the land here to Bolton Priory. Bolton Abbey is just further down the river here. And on the other side, sorry, on Wharfdale, just not that far away, on the other side, this belonged to the Maleverer family. they held the advowson, that's the running of the church at Kirby Malham, and the right to appoint the vicar there. They gave lands here on this side of the beck to Dereham Abbey at Norfolk. But these weren't the only abbeys to have lands round here. Coverham Abbey had lands above the cove, and especially Fountains Abbey had most of the lands around the tarn itself. Fountains Abbey had some of the land down here in the village, and they established a hall, as you'll see in a minute or so coming down here. So that's the importance of that. And this Clapper Bridge here across here, this stone is thought to come from the vehicle bridge just a little bit higher upstream when it was rebuilt. The guard railings were put on in the 1980s, I guess, to stop people falling into the beck down there. This little bridge here stands behind the Smithy, which we'll see in a second. Most people set off from here, crossing across it, then turning right at the end of the bridge because they're going to go on the Malham Round, a 6¼ mile walk that takes in Janet's Foss, Goredale Scar, Malham Tarn, and the Cove, and eventually turning back down here. So that's what a lot of the walkers tend to do, that traditional walk around there. It's quite tough because you've got to go to a waterfall at Goredale Scar, which if in full spate you can't actually do. So I mentioned about the Smithy. Quite a recent building in Malham. It was built in late Victorian times here. The last blacksmith here was Bill Wild. He retired in 2004 and gave the smithy and its income to Kirby Malham Church. And he said that it could only be used for a blacksmith for its entire future. Well, that was a bit of a problem for 3 years until this lady took over the rent of it. This is Annabel Bradley. Oddly, she was a tax accountant, but had an interest in silver jewellery and decided to learn the crafts of becoming a blacksmith. And so she's run that ever since there. She does the traditional repairs of sort of farm machinery and things like that, bespoke items that come in, as well as sort of traditional gates and fences and things like that. Some of these items that she sells from the forge. If she's working, you have to go in and see her at work like I did a few years ago here. Moving further up the road, we come to the Buck Inn on the left-hand side. That looks a fairly old building, but again, it's Victorian, probably built in the 1870s. This was built by Walter Morrison. We'll learn a bit more about him. He was an MP and an industrialist, and he lived at Tarn House on the other side of Malham Tarn. Again, we'll see that later on. He had lots of guests coming up to visit him, probably didn't want them to stay with him. So he built the pub down here really for those visitors coming to visit him. And so that's what the Buck Inn here as well. So we're going to come up this road here. This is Cove Road, going to the other side of Malham Village. You go over the bridge here, which you'll see in a minute. But just beyond the Buck Inn, this, where the village hall stands today, this was built in 1903 as a reading room, but this was the site of the Fountains Abbey, who had a small hall here as well to run their lands around here. And so we're looking at the building next to that. We can see a bit of that original hall. You say it was only probably a small building, but these window lintels in here belong to that old hall. So that's at the side of the Cove Road going up. If we just look at the river bridge, which comes across here, that's a village shop in there, because that's the village hall there and the house there, which has got the old lintels in. But we can cross across here, but this is really, I'm not just looking at the bridge here, because I'm going to end the talk, the second part of the talk, back here at the bridge here. So if we just look across there at the bridge, because this is where you get the better view from it, it was once quite a steep humpback bridge, typical of sort of middle-aged bridges. But then this was rebuilt and graded, so it came lower and lower and lower, largely a result of sort of farm wagons, horse-drawn wagons that had to come across here that couldn't cross those very steep bridges. And again, later on, were becoming a vehicle traffic as well. It's sort of built in two halves. You can just really see the join down here. This was sort of come along in the 18th century when it was made a lot lower. And we know that the side of it was rebuilt in 1636, according to documents. So that's the bridge that we're going to end on when we come back in part 2 of the talk. So if we continue up Cove Road, we come across this white building by the side of a road on the right-hand side called Cromwell Cottage. So called because one of the parliamentarian commanders lived in Ayrton, further down the valley, a General Lambert, and he had Oliver Cromwell as a guest up here, and he actually came to Malham Church, or Kirby Malham Church, and witnessed the baptism of a child there. So he most likely was brought up here to look at the cove and other things. So that's how it came to the name as Cromwell Cottage. So it probably does date from the 1650s, late 1640s. That leads across it. So you see that's Cromwell Cottage itself. It leads across to Malham Beck, and another of these clapper bridges across it. That comes to Beck Hall, the other side. We'll be coming down there in part 2 of this talk. So because Malham Beck being the dividing line for my talks as well. We continue up Cove Road and coming to Town Head Barn, which is this, that belongs to the National Trust, sometimes opened up as a centre for exhibitions and things like that. And here we see some traditional cottages as well of the 17th century. The road continues round here, and that's where the footpath leads off to the cove. And if you look carefully on the bit of film I show you, there's a turning to the right, and that's called Back Lane. And that's fairly traditional of a medieval village, to have the main street and then a back lane running behind it. That back lane runs all the way behind the village and actually ends up by the side of the National car park down there. So it does, it's quite an unmade track, and other tracks lead off it up to farms at the side of the dale around here. So let's have a look at the bit of film of going through Malham village up to this point. So that first part of the film was filmed at Hanliffe, which is a dead-end road that runs in the centre of Kirby Malham up onto the tops there and looks down the valley. So let's now go down to Malham Cove itself. It's about a mile from the village in total if you parked in the car park, and it'll take you about 25 minutes to get down there. It's quite interesting. This area here is called Shockley Hill. It lies between Malham Beck and the road that comes down the side of the Tarn that we've come down later on. And it's quite interesting here because of these Iron Age field systems here. And that's what you can see up there on the hillside. But you've got to look carefully, which is hard for me to show you on this bit of footage, this bit of film, this photograph here, because I can't enlarge in onto it. But here you can see these smaller fields which make up these much larger fields. The stone walls were probably built in early Victorian times or early 19th century, when the lands around here were enclosed. The enclosures probably started in the 1770s or something like that. The final enclosure award for Malham is 1849. So that's when all these stone walls were being built. But before that is that these Iron Age systems, fields, were surrounded by banks of soil around them. That's what you can see here. There's a rectangle there. There's another smaller rectangle there, and another one coming off there, and indeed into this corner of this wall there's one here. So they run up and down the side of the valley there, but some of these other ones come across, and that's to stop the slippage of the soil coming down the hillside there. So these were made up into myriad numbers of strips, but come probably post the dissolution in 1539, when landowners bought these up, they probably swapped and combined these Iron Age fields to make these much larger fields. So that's really what we can see up there. There's other features as well where the early man kept sheep and things like that, but they're further round the hill, more towards the road that comes down from the Tarn, Malham Rakes as it's called. So we now come to the most famous sort of geological feature of the lot, Malham Cove. It's around about 1,000 foot wide. Some people say it's 240 feet high, others say 260 feet. The book says it's almost 300 feet. Take what you want, depends where you're measuring it from. And this is a result of the Middle Craven Fault. This was formed really after before the last ice age, where there's a huge earth tremors around this, and the land dropped. So we can see here we've got the limestone wall of the cove here, but you need to go down another 300 feet to find more of that limestone. So really the displacement between the top of the cove and the top of the limestone that further down is around about 600 feet around here. The cove wall, say that's part of the fault, is made even steeper and say sheer, largely because after the ice age 10 to 12,000 years ago, there was an ice sheet that stood above here, about 500 foot deep. So the huge amount of water spilled down here, came across the lip of the cove and formed this very sheer wall all the way down it. You can say that behind it now is a dry valley, largely because we don't have any more ice up here to melt really, but the rainwater that falls down here percolates through the limestone and fills chambers that stand behind it, have been sort of dissolved away by this acid water. The last time water came over here, oddly, was fairly recently in December 2015. Huge amounts of water filled up those chambers behind it and forced the water over the lip of the cove itself. The first time in about 150 years. Last time it was seen was about 1870, but that was only a mist coming over, whereas actually genuine water coming over then. Only lasted one day and now reverted back to how it is. We'll be coming and looking back at the Dry Valley beyond there, coming down from the Tarn to have a look at that. Although on this piece of film, I've included some of the sort of that about it to understand the sort of the limestone around here. So let's have a look at this piece of film now.
Malham Cove, one of the greatest natural features of the Yorkshire Dales. Layers of Carboniferous limestone were laid down over 300 million years ago, when the climate round here was tropical, and it was covered by a vast sea. Later, a huge earthquake created the Craven Fault, which runs for 22 miles from Ingleton to Grassington. 10,000 years ago, it was covered by a glacier, and when that melted, water cascaded over the lip of the fault, leaving behind a sheer rock face. It also left behind, 1.5 miles away to the north, a natural lake, Malham Tarn. Water from the outfall disappears down a sinkhole, leaving ahead a dry valley as the water runs along passages and faults in the limestone. But it is not this water that seeps out of the bottom of the cave. This water has come from about 3/4 of a mile away. Geologists have proved this by using dyed water. The water from the tarn comes out of a spring called Aire Head 2 miles away to the south of Malham village. It's the true start of the River Aire. The cove is over 250 feet high and 980 feet wide. It's a strenuous climb up the 400 or so uneven steps. But on top of the cove there are magnificent views over the village of Malham and down the dale. It is difficult to walk across the top. It's made up of an area called Limestone Pavement. This has been caused by rainwater turning into acid water on contact with the limestone. This water has then eaten its way along and down the weak fissures in the rock. The blocks are called clints, and the gaps in between grikes. In these deep fissures, rare plants grow.
So here we come onto the limestone pavement, just a close-up of it there from the time that I took the film. It lies at really a 15-degree angle. What's quite important about it, it's probably best to come in the spring, is that there's acidic soil being washed down here, and only plants that can survive in that very poor soil can survive there, and they tend to come into flower during those late spring, early summer months. So it's worth going up there to have a look at that. So the next part of our route is taking the road up the side of the cove here, and then I'm coming to two spots really. This is Stockdale Lane that runs from Cove Road and goes over to Settle. That's about 5.5 miles away. That's quite a steep pull up to that to begin with. I've elected to walk up from here. There's a cattle grid here. You'll see on a bit of film there's a farmer talking to some people, and there's free parking here. There's parking down here for only 4 or 5 cars, but up here there's more parking than is available down there. So this track that comes up here, that leads across to Settle as well. That comes across the bottom of Attermire Scar. That's where Victoria Cave is on, and comes out at Castleburg Rock that stands above the town and then drops down into the market square in the town centre. Stockdale Lane comes across here and meets the track that I'm coming up here to Nappa Cross. That's what the gate is called here. Continues forward, eventually comes a metalled road. Again, drops down into Settle where the Folly is. That's the Museum of North Craven Life, and then enters the marketplace as well. So they're both these green lanes end up in the same place, because this is a joining track between the two of them. It's quite interesting here, but it's not marked on this map, but point B here, there's actually a public marked footpath that comes down to the Dry Valley here, and this is probably maybe the easiest point if you want to go and look at the limestone pavement on top of the cove. And so that comes down here, then drops down into the Dry Valley. But like I say, if you want to go down and look at the cove, you've got to come down those 400 uneven steps and then come back up them again as well. But if you don't want to come down, it's well worth coming up the Dry Valley. It's quite dangerous around here as well. A lot of the guidebooks say don't come down here if it's misty conditions, largely because you can lose your footing on this very deep chasm around here. And again, there's no railings at the edge of Malham Cove, so because if you can't see the lip of it, then there's a chance of falling over. So let's have a quick look at the film of just driving up to this point here, and then I'll point out the features that you can see on Pikedaw Hill. So this is Nappa Gate, as it's called, and is actually a gate. This is where the Stockdale Lane comes up from the Cove Road. It's about 1.25 miles up to here. There's a footpath sign here as well. This says it's part of the Pennine, not Pennine Way, that crosses further over across the top of the cove almost. But this is the Pennine Bridleway, and it's really for sort of walk, not for particularly for walkers, but for people on bicycles and say people walking, riding horses. And this is a loop off it that just comes round this section from Settle. The Pennine Bridleway starts off in Wirksworth in Derbyshire, which is 200 and is part of a 205-mile route. And it ends at Pendragon Castle near Kirby Stephen in Cumbria. So this is a loop around here as well. It was quite an industrial area up here. That's probably why Stockdale Lane was built as quite a substantial hard track coming up here, and even across here as well is that it's completely dry all the year round. That's largely because between 1800 and approximately 1830 miners came up here. They sunk shafts, and these where these cows are around here, but there's really nothing to see. These shafts are about 70 foot deep, but they're being backfilled, so they're just really depressions in the ground. They were mining for calamine, which is an ore of zinc, and that was used in the manufacture of brass. It wasn't smelted up here, but when we see a bit of film going from here across to Malham Tarn, there's a chimney to the right-hand side of the road, and that was a smelt mill there for it. Largely it was there because around that area, and especially on Fountains Fell, further over on Littondale, and easily transported around here, was coal. It wasn't particularly high quality coal, but it was the nearest source of coal. So it was smelted there. That means sort of superheating it, the rock, which didn't hold any of it, or being left up there, and then because of ignorance of that calamine being exported, probably across to Settle or probably down to Skipton and out that way. But that's what was really happening up here for that 30-year period. Just behind it is this sort of cairn of stones that walkers have left behind. This was a site of a Iron Age burial mound, so really 3,000 to 3,500 years ago. It was excavated in the Victorian times, and an Iron Age sword was found in there. And so it's been built up now by walkers leaving stones on the top. This is, you can see here, Malham Tarn in the background, and this wall, that's where the path comes up from the higher track where I've parked by the cattle grid. But if you come into this area just behind here, you can say it probably gets very wet if it's in the winter months. But this is one of the sources of Malham Beck. There's said to be 3 sources of it. There's the one by the smelt mill chimney near Malham Tarn, water running down there. Water draining from here goes down the hill, and just over there is Malham Cove itself. So this then sinks down, and this water from here seeps out of the bottom of the cove itself. So that's what you can see round here. If it's wet conditions, that will be full of water. It's called Nappa Cross, as I mentioned that a couple of times, because on this wall here, this is where the Nappa Gate is, but across the wall here, I think around about that position is the actual cross. It's not much to see really. It's a stump. It's the bottom of a cross. So it would have stood a lot higher and would have a cross head on top of that. It was really a way marker, and I guess it was stood near Stockdale Lane to people to say this is the road across to Settle that you need to aim for as well. It's been moved, and actually the base of the cross shaft is actually concreted in nowadays into this dry stone wall. It's quite hard to see. I met a lady who'd walked across here 7 or 8 times, and I asked where the cross was, and she knew nothing about it. She was about down here where these 2 walkers were, and I couldn't see it on the map that I was looking at as well, which is fairly vague. And it's only when I saw where the source of the Malham Beck could be, you can actually see it sticking up a little. So it is not as obvious to see. But the great thing about up here, it gives really good views around the Tarn area. And you can actually see how flat that area was around there. Because what all that area was in the Middle Ages was owned by Fountains Abbey, because they owned huge amounts of land in Yorkshire. So let's go back down and start to approach the Tarn this time. So coming back down to that cattle grid, and you can see that a path goes across there to the Tarn from if you're parking there, because say it's otherwise there's a car park over here by the Tarn itself. But it's quite surprising. I think people think they'll park at the Tarn and look across the water of it, but it's not like that, because it's about roughly a 10-minute walk from that car park across to see the Tarn itself, because there's well-made tracks across there. You also come to this junction here, which has got no signposts on it at all. To the left, this goes down to Langcliffe and then on to Settle. Straight ahead, this goes to Arncliffe, drops down there onto Littondale. Littondale runs across, connecting Ribblesdale with Wharfdale across here. We have to turn right in order to come to Malham Tarn itself. Wharfdale's joined across here, which we'll see on the second part of the talk on Malham, because this is where Stockdale Lane is. This is the old drovers road that the monks built, and that goes down to Kilnsea on Wharfdale. But we're only going to look at this area, and just below it as well, where it says water sinks down here. This is the path that runs down to the top of Malham Cove. I've got some film on that as well, which we'll see. So let's look at the Tarn itself. This body of water remains here in a limestone area only because during the retreat of the glacier, as it scraped its way backwards, leaving these sort of limestone features behind, is that it's actually stands on the slate bed, which is quite unusual, and then the limestone beneath that. That's why it's an impermeable surface, and that's why we get the water around here. The Tarn would never have been as big as this 200 years ago, largely because Walter Morrison, who I've mentioned before, who lived in Tarn House, had the dammed at the outflow and has artificially made the water a lot higher here than it would have been. It's at its deepest, it's 14 foot. He wanted it because guests to his house could come fishing around the Tarn here. So the greater depth of water and obviously the stocking of the Tarn with fish made it a good place to go angling. It covers around about 153 acres, and you can say its outflow, as we'll see in a minute, goes further down there. So let's have a look at the trip here to arrive at the Tarn. So this is Tarn House at the other side of the Tarn. It was built in 1852 when the Morrison family bought the estate round here. An earlier house of 1780 stood around here. Today, it belongs to the National Trust and is used as a field centre for students who come up here to study the geology and sort of climate and other things around here of it. So it's really accommodation around here. But like I say, Walter Morrison took over this on the death of his father in 1857. And he was a very influential character. He was the MP for Craven, based in Skipton, and he was also High Sheriff of Yorkshire as well. And because he had amassed a great deal of wealth, and that's why he really lived up here during the summer period, because he was an MP and actually lived down in London. He was very influential around Malham itself. He seemed to enjoy it around here. In the grounds of here, he created the Malham Tarn School, and that operated between 1872 and 1946. Those children progressing from there either went to Langcliffe School, that's on the road down to Settle, or they went to the school at Kirby Malham. In 1947, the house became the Malham Tarn Field Centre, and still is run as such today. So a little about Walter Morrison, because he's hugely influential in the area. He also gave the money for the building of a chapel at Giggleswick School, but would cost a fair amount of money. But he never married, so perhaps that's why he did have a lot of money. He was born in London on the 21st of May, 1836. His father, James, was the Liberal MP for Ipswich, and maybe it's through his family connections down there that he came to buy the estate, because it seemed to quite a long way from Ipswich to Malham, because they'd been very far flung in those days. And so that he rebuilt the house, in 1857 after his father had died. He was known as the Argentine king of meat. That's where he made his money from. There'd been these ships that originally came across, these freezer ships that could bring that Argentinian beef over. And I guess some of it was tinned as well in late Victorian times, the corned beef that came across there. He was a very keen supporter of the arts, and like I say, he seemed to be a very willing person to have visitors here. Some famous ones. He had Charles Darwin, who wrote The Origin of Species, published in the 1850s. He had John Ruskin, he was an all-round poet and biographer, and also Judge Hughes, the author of Tom Brown's School Days. His most notable guest to us is probably the Reverend Charles Kingsley, the author of The Water Babies. He came up here to do some trout fishing in the Tarn and described Malham as the best on the whole earth. And so let's have a bit more about Walter Morrison. He was the MP for Skipton, 1886 to 1892. High Sheriff, and again, MP for Skipton, 1895 to 1900. High Sheriff of the West Riding of Yorkshire in 1883. 1905, he was chairman of the Craven Bank, also based in Skipton. He died in 1921 up here at Tarn House, left a lot of money to Kirby Malham Church, which had also given money to, if you go inside, there's sort of wooden screens and the pews all dedicated to him, and he's buried in the churchyard down there as well. I mentioned about the Reverend Charles Kingsley. He's the chap that wrote The Water Babies, said to have been inspired by Malham Cove itself, and because it was first serialized in Macmillan's magazine, 1862 to 1863. It was fairly typical of Victorian novelists. I think most of Charles Dickens' novels were serialized before they were published in book form. This was published in book form later in 1863 itself. It tells the story of Tom, a chimney sweep who drowns in a river and becomes a water baby. It's said that there's various things that levels that it works on. It's meant to be a critique of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. And it's also about child labour as well. So it's a bit of social commentary on that. Although people take against it today because they say it's racist against Americans, Jews, Catholics and the Irish. So really most of the people who it could offend in the world. So That's the Malham's association with the book The Water Babies. So this is the Tarn Outfall. So you'll see it on that bit of film where the cows were drinking at the outfall, and a short bridge goes across it to take the traffic. So I'm looking upwards from that. That's Tarn House over there. And I guess, and again, best to see when it's in flood coming out of here. Largely because although it's always an overspill coming down here, but if you say it's in full spate coming down here, it's best to see then the water sink. This is part of the dry valley around here. And as you can see, when it's in full spate in September, when I walk down here, you can walk down the middle of it as dry as a bone. But come November, a few years ago, when I walked down here, it's best to see where the water comes down here, comes down this sinkhole down here. This is where the North Craven Fault is, because especially where it follows the road. And so really that's what we're seeing, the fault line coming along this dry valley along here. And that's why the water disappears down this sinkhole here. And it's the water here that reappears at Aire Head Springs below the village. So the water here comes out 2 miles further on. And so it's this water here that is the source, the real source of the River Aire. So it's fascinating to see that when you come down here. And this is called the Watlowes Dry Valley. As I mentioned earlier, it was only wet as recently as December 2015, when there's enough water coming down here for the water to cascade over the lip of the cove. I'm taking this from just behind the cove, so I'm looking up here. So the Tarn is well over here, so it's about 1.5 miles away. And I've put this into a film, so I've put a drone up really from near the Tarn itself, look at the first part, and then I've flown it over over from this side so you can see the second part of it. It's just got some music on, but it ends towards the end because I think it's worth looking at that. And really, that's where I'm going to end today's talk. And because you can see where all the water's disappeared from. This is where the path comes around up here. So it's quite a dangerous path to come down here. That's what people are warning against. And then it drops down here. So it's actually quite a formidable walk up and round there to get up to the Tarn itself. But it's quite exciting scenery, as you can see around here, made all the better. Now we can just watch it and don't have to walk it. So until next time, when I continue with part 2, that's the end of today. So thank you for watching.